everyone, welcome back to our next episode of Shelf Indulgence, where we talk about books and genres that don't normally get the book club treatment. This month, we're talking about private eye mysteries. So we're going to kick it over to Star to give us a little bit of history.
Okay, so I read that detective fiction started back in the 1800s, around the time of the Industrial Revolution. The theory is that people began moving from rural areas into cities, and the more populated the cities became, the more interaction people had with strangers, and the more suspicion and crime happened. And it was in the early mid-1800s where a lot of the police forces started to be established. And they're saying that the modern detective story started with Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, that was published in serial form in 1841. It was a short story that featured a detective, and strangely enough, he also lived with another gentleman friend, and the story was told from the friend's point of view, like in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And he uses logic and evidence to solve a crime. I read that the first detective novel was Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone in 1868. And that developed a lot of the classic detective tropes. And it was thought that he based his character on one of the first detectives in Scotland Yard. And then, of course, the most popular worldwide known private detective, Sherlock Holmes, started to be published in 1887 by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He had a few novels and a lot of short stories that were published. And everybody suggests that his character was based on the detective in Poe's story, and also real-life surgeon and lecturer, Dr. Joseph Bell, who apparently used a lot of logic when he spoke. And then we move forward a little bit, and we have the golden age of writing, and we have Agatha Christie and some others who were very popular. And they published novels that sort of worked like a puzzle, where there was clues and things you could put together and solve the crime at the end. But then after that, some people felt that that type of mystery, which we now call cozy mysteries, wasn't necessarily realistic, and it didn't necessarily, real crime didn't work that way. And so around the 1920s started what we called hard-boiled detectives. These detectives dealt with more corrupt cops and organized crime, and some other things. They couldn't trust other people. And it started with some American pulp magazines in the 20s, and then developed in the 30s and 40s. Dashiell Hammett was in the 20s and 30s, and he gave us The Maltese Falcon with Sam Spade. And then Raymond Chandler had Philip Marlowe in The Big Sleep in 1939, and he had some other ones there. And those were more of the gritty, classic noir, dark streets and rain and distrustful cops and that kind of a thing. And these detectives, of course, were male, and they had a sense of extreme justice that they wanted to see that happen. But they were a little bit removed from society, but they really cared about the community that they lived in. And often they had some sort of ties with police, either they were a former cop or military. So they had some informants, but they had to decide who to trust. And so they were a little bit more emotional. Sometimes they drank, they had emotional scars, and they were a little bit flawed in character. And then, of course, we moved to more current, where you see some more female detectives and more ethnic diversity in our stories. So it's kind of come a long way, instead of just an easy, neat, tied up crime, to how society works and how crime works, and how you can't necessarily tie things up in a bow and move on and just always find that one person that's evil and everybody else is perfectly innocent. So that's kind of a history of how it's been going. So I'm going to talk about my book first, since mine is more of a classic. I read vintage Conan Doyle. I read The Hound of the Baskervilles, and it's one of the best known Sherlock Holmes stories. It's not the first, but it's one of the best known ones. It was published first in a serial form in 1901 and 1902, and published together as one novel in 1902. And it features the legend of the Hound of Baskervilles. There was a family, and the Baskerville family in Dartmoor, and there was an ancestor, Hugo Baskerville, who at one point kidnapped a young woman and took her to his castle. And she eventually ended up escaping and running off through the moors. And he gets on his horse and he tries to go get her back. And his friends go after him to try to stop him. And they end up finding 2 dead bodies. The girl was dead. It was thought she was just from exhaustion and fear of running for her life. And Hugo Baskerville was found, the legend said, being eaten by a hellhound that was ripping his throat apart, and began the tale of the hound. And so fast forward, we have Sir Charles Baskerville, who's been living there and believes in the family lore and doesn't like to go out to the moors at night. And eventually they find him dead just outside his driveway. And there's no like physical evidence, but he has like a look of fear on his face. So they don't know exactly what happens. So his friend, Dr. Mortimer, travels to London to talk to the famous Sherlock Holmes to get his advice. They found a relative who's coming to claim the family home and everything. And he's wondering, should he tell this new guy about the legend and what happened possibly to the relative? He doesn't want anything to happen to him, but he doesn't want to scare him off either. And so he goes to Sherlock Holmes and Watson's office and tells him what's going on. And he says, well, when Sir Henry Baskerville arrives in London, bring him here and we'll talk. So he brings him there, and he's like, well, interesting enough, on my way here, somebody gave me this warning, like not to go there, and I don't know what any of this means. Somebody steals one of his boots. And so Sherlock Holmes decides that they should go back to Dartmoor, and Watson should go with him because he's too busy to go, but Watson will give him reports and he'll think about it. So the doctor and Sir Henry and Watson go back to the house, and there's of course all kinds of strange things. The butler's going to quit, and there's a prisoner on the loose, and there's some strange people in town. And I don't want to give away the mystery, but you know, Sherlock Holmes uses his logic and, you know, solves the case in the end. It was a very good story. I enjoyed it. I did think at times it's good that it's told from Watson's point of view instead of Sherlock Holmes. At times he's rather rude to Watson, which I felt bad at the beginning. Sometimes he's complimentary, and sometimes he's sort of not. Kind of makes snide remarks, which I find, you know, disconcerting. But, you know, it all works out in the end. I did end up reading the short story, the Poe short story that was done, you know, many years before this. And I was extremely surprised at the similarities between that story and Sherlock Holmes. He also lives with a male friend who tells the story instead of the detective, and they use the clues and logic to solve the case, which it was kind of a strange and gruesome tale. If you haven't read it, you can read Poe short story online. It's, I think, on the government website. It's out of public, it's in the public domain now, so you can look it up online. But if you like Sherlock Holmes, I might recommend reading the Poe story just to kind of see maybe how much Sherlock Holmes is based on Poe's ideas in that story. So that was mine. And now we're going to see what Marnie read.
Okay, Hi, everybody. I actually am a huge fan of The Hand of the Baskervilles. You're right, Sherlock is mean. I read Cocaine Blues by Carrie Greenwood, and I actually read the ebook because it was convenient. Carrie Greenwood is an Australian author and lawyer, and she's written many plays and books, but most notably is her historical detective novel centered on the character of Phryne Fisher. And if you've seen the show, there's also a really popular show based on the books. I think actually the show is more. I like the show a little bit better, but I'll get into that later. So the book is actually, this is the first novel of the Phryne Fisher mystery series. And although the novel starts out in London, it actually is set in the late 1920s, Melbourne, Australia. And the Honorable Miss Phryne Fisher is young and wealthy, and she is attending a fancy high society dinner. And someone attempts to steal jewels of one of the dinner guests, and she solves the mystery, of course, quickly, easily. And one of the guests in attendance is so impressed with her that they ask her if she can help solve or investigate, rather, a possible poisoning. And so she decides it might be rather amusing to try her hand at being a lady detective, because why not? And heads off to Melbourne to investigate. So she's actually, the character Phryne Fisher was originally from Melbourne, but she wasn't always rich. She grew up extremely poor until several relatives, as the book describes it, get killed in the war, and her father inherits the title. So her background helps her character, I think, gives it more depth, because she just has a greater perspective on all the people she embarks and meets along the way. And she does meet people along the way. She kind of gets a team together, sort of, from the people that she meets. And they're so unlikely and different as they can be. There's Bert, and I don't know how to pronounce some of the names, because there's a lot of also like lingo that I don't know, like, slang. But the taxi drivers, and then she meets someone who is about to commit a crime against someone who's wronged her. And of course, why not ask her to be your maid and assistant? It's totally fine, But all of these characters actually have, what I noticed was one thing in common, and that they have a strong sense of justice and fairness, and they all care about people in their own ways. And so they suddenly just begin to orbit around Phryne, because she has, she shares the same beliefs, and she also has the intellect and the wherewithal to help others. So it's a fun mystery. I don't know that believability might be something of a question, because in the book the character is very young, just like in her 20s. So this is what I meant about, I think the show captures her a little better. In the show she's a little older, and you can kind of believe that she would be that cynical or that knowledgeable about some things, whereas in the novel she's just this young thing, like, how do you know this stuff? So anyway, but it was enjoyable and fun. And I think more than the mystery, which I usually like to get into the mystery and solve it, I think that what's most interesting is really the people that she works with. They're just impossible not to kind of love. They really pull you in. So the people are the most fun, I think. And second is just Phryne. This book was actually published, and I should have said that first, in 1989. So she's a very strong female character, but at the time that was kind of amazing. So, but she is enjoyable to read because she's just fabulous and full of contradictions. Independent, rich, a little cynical, but not afraid to question or challenge others. But above all, she's kind of just determined to live her life and enjoy it to the fullest, which is so much fun. Because, in the 20s, women are supposed to have a certain sense of decorum, and she does not. So it's fun. It's a fun book to escape, It's just fun to imagine it and to see her help people and get justice. She's just looking for satisfaction on her own terms. So it's kind of impossible not to fall in love with her. So I enjoyed it very much. I won't spoil it because it is kind of wonderful, fun, light read. I strongly recommend it.
So
Who is next?
it's me. So I read a detective that also takes place in 1929. The book was published in 2003. It is Maisie Dobbs by Jacqueline Winspear. And I went into it thinking that it would be a little bit more like Franny Fisher, because I was initially going to read a Franny Fisher, but I kind of loved the show too, and I didn't want to like taint the reading of the book with everything that I love about the show. So I set that aside. I went with Maisie, and I liked it a lot, but it definitely feels like the introduction to the character. So we have kind of a dual narrative here. We start with the framing the current day 1929 mystery, and then there's a length of the novel that goes back in time to tell us how we got there. So Maisie Dobbs is a lady's maid in 1910, and she has to go into service at the age of 13 because her father, who is like a, I can't remember the term. They say it multiple times in the book, but basically he's a peddler on the streets of London. And good guy, like heart of gold. Everybody in this book pretty much has a heart of gold, like you like everybody. And so she's working in service for Lady Compton, and Lady Compton catches her reading late at night. So she's like, oh, I'm going to introduce you to my friend Maurice Blanche, who becomes her like mentor, and he's kind of a Poirot type character. And she gets mentored by this guy who's tutoring her, and she eventually gets into one of the colleges at Cambridge, which is a big deal. But her education is cut short by the onset of World War I, and she goes and volunteers as a nurse. She does eventually finish her university degree and things like that. She studies psychology and is a well-rounded woman who seems to know kind of a little bit of everything. If you do the math, she's 32 at the beginning of this series. And it's kind of like with Franny Fisher, where you're kind of like, how does she know how to do all that stuff? So, but she's almost like a Nancy Drew type, like just perfect. So she was a little bit inaccessible, because another big point of this book is that we jump forward to after the Great War, and you just have this overwhelming sense of collective sadness at what went on in World War I. So that the tone is definitely not like cozy mystery style. It's very sort of introspective. She has to come to terms with what has gone on in her personal life. And there's kind of a dual mystery here that ties up together. So we find out how she became a detective, and she does open a private detective agency, which is another reason I picked this book. And she takes on a case that at its surface level seems to be about a wife who is cheating on her husband. But Maisie finds out very quickly that it actually is not a case of infidelity. It's that she is mourning her first love, who was disfigured in World War II, and eventually went to a place called the Retreat. And everybody who goes to the retreat basically cuts all ties with their families and signs over all of their money and assets to the retreat. And basically, as she is investigating the retreat and reacquainting herself with all of the horrors of World War I, because everybody at the retreat has been like badly damaged. Most of them have like the facial prosthetics and things like that. She is sort of getting over some PTSD that she had regarding what happened with a lover that she had in the war. And it's good. It's got some culty vibes at the retreat, and the mystery itself really isn't that much of a mystery. And so, like I said, I was overall left with the feeling that this is the introduction to the character. It's not very long. And to be honest, the part that does take us back in time drags just a little bit, but I would absolutely stick it through to read 2 or 3 more books. There's like 20 of them and they're still being published. So I recommend, but with the caveat that you're probably going to want to read more of it, or you might even want to skip forward in the series because she is like kind of Nancy Drewish. And it's like, I don't know if this is a relatable character so much, but I also do love Nancy Drew. So I'm not hating. I'm not, because I love Nancy Drew. So anyways, Stephanie, what did you read?
So I read Gone Baby Gone by Dennis Lehane. It was published in 1998 and it is number 4 out of 6. I didn't read any of the other ones, but there wasn't a lot of like any background information that was in it. He kind of like explains it to you. So I didn't feel like I was missing anything from the other books. So you could read it as a standalone and like be perfectly fine. So this one centers around Patrick Kenzie and Angie Gennaro. They're sort of like private detectives. They grew up in Boston where these books take place, and they sort of have ins with people that the cops don't. So they are able to find and learn of information that the cops would never be able to get. So the book starts with Amanda McCready is 4 years old and she's taken from her home. The mother claims that she like left her by herself. She was just at her like neighbor's house. They were watching TV. She was gone for like half an hour. And, you know, someone not even broken, like the door was unlocked, but they came in and they took Amanda. And so all of Boston PD is looking for Amanda. But Amanda's aunt and uncle, Beatrice and Lionel, they get in contact with Patrick and Angie, and they ask them to also start working on the case. They heard that Patrick and Angie sort of like obsess over the cases that they take on, and they don't really stop until they find some answers or they solve it. So Patrick and Angie start working with like the special unit that works on like missing children. They the contact are Remy Broussard and Nick Poole, and they work together and they sort of like try to track down Amanda's whereabouts, like what Amanda's mother was really into and if she had any sort of like seedy connections. So this book takes you through like Boston's underworld, and you meet a lot of crazy characters, and it gets really dark for a while. So this movie, it was also made a movie. Ben Affleck directed it. It came out in like 2007. I will say that the movie is sort of very different than the book. It has a lot of similarities, but like the storyline diverges a little bit. I would be weary if you're going to read this book. Like I said, it is pretty dark. You know, there's like missing children and you meet a lot of unsavory characters, but it was very well written. I was hesitant about reading it at first. Like when I first started, I was like, yeah, this is gonna haunt me a little bit, but it was really interesting and I needed to follow through. I needed to find out what happened. It's sort of a happy ending, but not really. So I would recommend it. Just be careful.
This is one of my favorite genres, but I have to admit that I watch more of the private eye type shows than I read of the books. So reading was a different experience. I think I picked one that was like, had some of the hallmarks of the cozy mystery, kind of like Franny Fisher, but it's definitely more of like a historical novel. There's a lot of references to World War I. And like I said, the tone is very sort of like, you just have this overarching sense that there's this collective depression in England over World War I, and it's not like that easy to get through. So I'm glad that it was short. I did start to read The Urn Burial by Carrie Greenwood, which I think is like book 7 in Franny Fisher. And that's one of the ones that starts with, Lin Chung, who's like one of her only long-standing lovers.
Mhm.
And I remember him from
I was like,
but I only remember him from the show. So I'm like picturing them as they were in the show. And that's why I was like, I can't read this. That's all I'm going to be thinking about is the show. So
Yeah.
I love detectives.
Yeah, the show bled into the book as I was reading because I saw the show first. And of course,
Yeah.
in the show, she and the detective have like a little, unspoken thing. Whereas in the book, that's not. So I was kind of bummed.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. He was sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And you do get a sense. Sorry.
No, I think that like there's also not that much of that. It takes place basically in the same time as my book, but there's not that same sense, even though she's living in Australia and had served in World War I as a nurse, which I thought was interesting. You don't really get that sense that she's like struggling over it. She's
You
living her life.
don't. Yeah, she's living her life and she
Yeah.
is promiscuous. And, but you do get a sense of like the difference in classes. You get from the difference in lifestyles. You do get that from her books because it's a constant source of relatability where she knows where they're coming from, but she is so far above her life in fashion and she's always looking her best.
Yeah.
But yeah, she's not sweating the small stuff at all.
Yeah, I feel like with detectives, you really don't have that much as a reader in common with most of them. And that's always how I felt about Sherlock Holmes. I'm just kind of like, okay, I don't get it. I don't get how he's reaching these conclusions, but I'm here for it. Seems like a stretch to notice that the pin was a certain color on somebody's like shirt sleeve or something. And that's the core of the whole mystery, but okay. But you see that a lot with Agatha Christie too. Like for sure.
Bryony is too young to know these things. And then to be so like some of the parts where she likes the younger men, and like, you're 20. How much younger can the guy get?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I'm just like, so, and the show is better for me because it just makes sense. Oh, a younger, she's like in her late 30s, 40s. That makes sense. And then with them, we're like, what are we talking about?
I think it's tough. I think it's tough to develop these really well-known detectives for the screen because like I can't read Agatha Christie anymore because all I think of is David Suchet as Poirot, and that's not really how he's described. Yeah, his little mustaches. And same with Sherlock Holmes. Now I can only picture Benedict Cumberbatch.
I know.
I don't know. I mean, a lot of the talk about the history, I mean, they say like a lot of the original detectives, you didn't really get a lot of depth into their character. They were kind of removed and aloof, and like Sherlock Holmes spends times like, I need to be alone and just in his own thoughts or smoking his pipe or apparently taking cocaine or doing some other strange thing. And like, it's like, don't talk to me. I have to go think. I think that's why a lot of these early ones, the detective themselves don't tell the story. So, I mean, I guess it's better coming from a person that has like more feelings and more thoughts, because the detective themselves are just spending their whole time just thinking of these minute details, which wouldn't be necessarily very interesting or, like you said, relatable.
Mm-hmm.
And they're always kind of dark.
Yeah. I think a difference too is that with a lot of the older detectives, they are just white men and they don't let their, like basically their tools are logic, cold logic. And it's like, okay.
Yeah, I did enjoy the undertone of feminism in the Franny Fisher books. Like her doctor friend is a doctor and a female and very strong-minded. And I did like this undertones of rebellion and just the double standard for women are concerned.
Yeah, I like revisiting the eras that the classics were being written in, but from the modern perspective. So
yes.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe it's not totally realistic, but it makes me feel better about what I'm reading.
Same.
Yeah.
I enjoy it more. Yeah, I do think it's also interesting because I'm thinking about Poirot written by a woman and the detectives that I've read written by men, and Agatha Christie like really did a good job of giving him like realistic foibles. Like he's the fussy little Belgian. So I think he is still my favorite fictional detective. But I really like female authored detective fiction now as a modern reader more than most of the classics. I still have a soft spot for Sherlock, but
Sigh. You're thinking of Benny, aren't you?
I am.
Same.
I also think about Charles Dickens, who wrote some early detective fiction too, because there's like his books were so long and they were all written in a serial format that he'd just like introduce new threads. So one of the ones that I kind of revisited for this program too was Bleak House. And if you haven't read Bleak House, it's dense, it's a lot, but it's actually got a pretty good mystery at its heart. And I really like the detective in that one, who is actually an inspector for Scotland Yard named Inspector Bucket. And there's a good adaptation on BBC with Gillian Anderson, who I love her so much. So I recommend, if you're not going to read it, at least watch it, because the Inspector Bucket character is really interesting and absolutely reminds me, going back to that Poe, like Poe and Dickens were really establishing the genre at that point. Thank you again for joining us for another edition of Shelf Indulgence Book Club. Next month, we will be reading Hispanic and Latinx fiction to celebrate American, Hispanic, and Latino Heritage Month. And we hope to see you then. Thanks.
And yes, this is the best part of my day. So thank you guys.
Yes.
It's always fun.